The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. Now this is book 1 of the Burning series, as it's known, and book 2 is coming out later this year. I believe it's November 10th of 2020, and that is The Fires of Vengeance. You can pre-order it now. There is no cover art yet, unfortunately, but if it's anything like the cover art for this, it's gonna kick ass. Carlo Ortiz did a fantastic job with this cover art. It's some of the prettiest cover art that I've seen for a book in a long time. I'd say compared to a lot of hardcover art, it's up there in quality. I read Fate of the Fallen recently, and that has some fantastic cover art as well. I know it's a sin to judge a book by its cover, but when I saw this in the bookstore, I was like, yep, I'm getting that. Now, quick background on the style of fantasy that this is. This is not a typical European Christian-based mythology kind of fantasy setting. This book is African-based, so this pulls a lot from African culture, and a lot of the words and terminology in this book really speaks to that setting and that, I guess, area of the world. What I did really appreciate from this book is the setting and the magic system were totally different than anything else that I've read in fantasy ever. I can't think of another African setting that I've read. The magic system in this, where they pull their powers from, is totally different than anything that I've seen before, and that was super cool. I do see a lot of comparisons called out of Game of Thrones, Gladiator. That's probably just to sell the book, honestly. I don't see much of Game of Thrones in this book at all. And that's not a bad thing. I don't see that comparison. I understand the Gladiator comparison a little bit, definitely. The character of Maximus in Gladiator, the struggles and the heartbreak that he goes through, and the way that his character shifts from being a gladiator in the arena to where he ends up in that movie, as well as the kind of bond that he forms with the other slaves and other gladiators. I definitely see the parallels of that, but I would actually akin this book closer to Red Rising, which I actually just finished reading about a week ago. These two books are way more similar than I would say Game of Thrones or Gladiator are to The Rage of Dragons. Red Rising is very similar in the sense that the main character is kind of the bottom tier of a caste system, much like Rage of Dragons. They both have to suffer heartbreak early on in the book. They both grow through that. They have to fight a lot. There's constant battles. They kind of rally people to their cause. There are a lot of similarities between these two books, both pretty dark, very violent, very action-packed, fast-paced. So if I had to compare this book to anything, it would be Red Rising. This is definitely one of those books where the pacing was so fast and relentless and action-packed that I, as cliche as it is to say, could not put this book down. Just chapter to chapter, bouncing from battle to battle to battle. I mean, this was intense and really kept me at the edge of my seat and engaged the entire time because the combat was so well done and so well written, and I loved a lot of these characters that it made all of these different scenes a ton of fun. And as soon as one ended, you flip chapter and it immediately rolls into another combat scene. What's a good way of putting this? Because there aren't a bunch of POVs bouncing back and forth in this book, it's kind of one continuous story, almost like you're watching a movie, and it just goes chapter to chapter, scene by scene, and kind of keeps pace with this main character of Tao. And I really appreciated that because it made this book a very easy read. The writing was super accessible. Basically, there was never a dull moment in this book. And if you love combat as much as I do in a story, this book is for you because there is an awful lot of combat in this book. But let's step back for a second. So our main character, Tao, is the protagonist of this story, and he's what is known as a lesser. So in this society, it is a caste system. So there's noblemen, there's lessers, and they're essentially commoners, farmers, almost like slaves. They're treated like crap. They can kind of be killed on a whim, and if a nobleman kills one of them, it's just kind of like, who cares? They're a lesser, they're not important. As a lesser, much like in the beginning of Gladiator, Tao suffers a loss, which drives him for the remainder of the story. I don't want to get into too much about what that is because I don't want to spoil anything, but it is the driving force of his character. And since this is a revenge story, he uses that vengeance and that fire within him, that rage, to really fuel his entire mission. His entire drive this story is to rank up in the military to the point where he can blood duel people that are above him, because if he were to do that as a lesser, he would basically just be tried as a criminal and hung or executed, however you want to say it. So he has to rise to a certain rank in the military and qualify to be able to say that he's on that level of a nobleman above him, so that he can actually blood duel them and exact his revenge. Now, I totally understand Tao's reasoning for his drive and his rage throughout this story. I promise I'm not just saying rage because it's called Rage of Dragons. That is an accident. But his vengeance and his revenge-driven plot in this story gets him into a lot of trouble. He's very hot-headed, and that revenge being at the forefront of his mind almost clouds his judgment a lot of times. So there is more than one time where he goes into a situation, and whether it's just his own life or people around him, he does put them in jeopardy because he basically tunnel visions a lot, and when he sees somebody that is kind of on his list of names that he wants to kill, he just tunnel visions and says, like, this guy needs to die right now. And everyone's like, Tao, no, like, that crap can wait, or no, don't do that, like, let's think about this. And he's just like, no rage. So there are a few times in this book where it's just like, oh my god. Having said that, I do see where he's coming from, because what happens to him in the beginning of the story, it makes sense that you would be that angry about it, but sometimes it's like, dude, just ease up a little bit. Now, the world building, I wouldn't say is anything spectacular in this book. Evan Winter did make me feel for these characters and this entire group that Tao travels with and battles with throughout the story. But when it comes to world building, I'd say this book is a little bit lacking. It is definitely more streamlined and focused in the story that it's trying to tell. It's not trying to be some grand epic world. And maybe he's saving some of that for the Fires of Vengeance and further issues of this series. But in this book alone, it's nothing like a Lord of the Rings or a Mistborn or Stormlight Archives or Malazan, where it's some big grand epic, crazy world. It is much smaller and focused. You have a couple of cities here and there. You're traveling roads. It's a much more condensed area that you stick to, but I do have a feeling that is going to grow and scale a lot in the following books. But the main focus of this is, of course, the combat. Like I mentioned before, it's violent, it's gritty, it's intense, it's relentless. Whatever other word you can think of, this book is that when it comes to combat. I mean, there is so much of it that at times I was just like, oh my god, there's another battle happening? In a good way, but there are times when I was just like, wow, like they're still fighting. Now, the magic system in this book is a little bit different as well. I wouldn't say that it's a hard magic system, and I wouldn't really say it's a soft magic system either. There are some parameters that are established early on. So 1 in every 1,000 women are what is called a gifted, which they are basically able to perform certain powers and have access to these abilities that other women are not. And that's typically, they can essentially enrage warriors in battle. So they channel this energy. I'm not going to say where they pull it from because that would probably be a spoiler. But this energy that they channel, they pump into these warriors and essentially make them gigantic beasts. They become stronger, they become faster, they can withstand a lot more blows, they can basically take on armies in very small groups. So that's their main power. And they can, of course, as is established early on, call down dragons. Now, it's a little bit vague, and I wouldn't say the dragons play a massive part in this book, because they don't, but they are there, and the gifted are the ones that are able to kind of control them. Now, for the men, you have what are called the chosen, and those are 1 in every 100 men are able to do this. Typically, they have to be from a higher noble class. Their blood is essentially supposed to be stronger than that of a lesser. So lessers are not meant to be able to stand toe-to-toe with a chosen or be an Inganyama. I hope I'm saying that correctly, which are those guys that go into battle and are enraged by a gifted. Now, this makes for some pretty interesting combat scenes as well, because when these gifted and chosen get involved in the combat, it just gets even more intense, because you have these rage monsters just hacking and slashing at people. You've got gifted basically being behind the scenes, pumping these guys up, keeping them in the fight longer. So that was super cool to watch. And with that, the combat actually kind of kept me worried, honestly, for Tao and the rest of the cast, because I honestly didn't know who was going to live or die in a lot of these fights. Now, typically, in a lot of fantasy stories, whether it be a book, a movie, or TV show, you kind of don't really worry too much about the main character being injured or dying. Not in this book. This book will make you think multiple times that like a character may die here, and that's just the reality of the situation, and it happens. The last thing about Tao as a main character, he is definitely not what is known as a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, whichever term you prefer. He takes some L's in this book. Now, this being Evan Winter's first book, I was floored by the quality of this thing. Like I said, I just read it 2 months ago, so February of this year, and I guess he self-published it back in 2018, and then it got picked up by Orbit and redistributed. And the fact that this was his first book, I mean, the quality of this thing is insane. There are so many other books where you read their first story, like Robin Hobb, or you read a Brandon Sanderson, and you can go back and read their first books and be like, yeah, that was definitely their first book. Like, they're 10, 14, 15 books into the series now. I can understand that they've grown as a writer. You could have told me that Evan Winter had written multiple series before this book, and I would have believed it, because that's how good this book was. The quality was top notch. The writing was engaging. The characters were well done. I have very little negatives to this story. And if this is what we get from his first go at it, I can only imagine how much better this story is going to be when book 2 comes out, and book 3, and book 4? I don't know how many books he's going to write, but I think it's at least 3. As you can clearly tell by this review, I personally loved it, but I want to know what you guys think. So please leave a comment down below. Let me know if you liked this book, if you did or you didn't, what you hated about it, what you loved. I would love to hear your opinion on it, so go ahead and drop a comment down there. Like and subscribe, of course, if you do enjoy this content. And as always, keep reading.